So I'll use you again here. Let's go back into the exact same position. So again, we talked about how lots of this stuff isn't really super possible if I'm not controlling my opponent's head with my legs, right? When I say like controlling my opponent's head with my legs, and even when I'm in mount, I'm always like keeping a little bit of tension on my hamstring and adductor and squeezing in, okay? If I'm in mount and I have like zero pressure on my hips here, it's so easy for him to bump me off, right? You can bump me like this way. I'm just gonna fly off. Yeah, just bump me, right? I'll just fly off. But if I can just exert 30% tension on my legs, now try to bump me, it's just way harder for him, right? And he feels pretty stuck here. So let's use that same concept with the head here. If I can like, kind of squeeze him with my head, with my legs a little bit, it's gonna suck for him. Okay guys, so let's talk about a little bit of like hip mobility I can do that's BJJ specific, right? So I'm always using my hips in jiu-jitsu for internal and external rotation. So let's train some of those aspects first by making some space in the internal rotation. So I'm gonna step in my 90-90 here. I'm doing this on kind of an angle with a kickstand. I'm gonna have my foot in line with my back knee and my back foot here. So you can see I have like a nice little line. What I'm gonna do to initiate the stretch is just pull this tissue back, like I'm trying to get my hip bone to my butt. Now, if you've never done this stretch before, this is just gonna feel a little bit weird. You might not feel that full rotation right just yet, but that's why we're gonna hold this stretch for about 2 minutes. And over the next 2 minutes, my goal is to just get relaxed and really just let the tissue do its thing. I'm not putting too much force into it. I'm just applying what's called a passive stretch for my back hip internal rotation. It doesn't really matter how you're setting up your hands, as long as you can see this angle pulling backwards. Once we've done the stretch for 2 minutes, we're gonna apply a pails contraction, okay? So that's just fancy words for an isometric contraction. For this isometric contraction, I'm gonna try to push my foot down to create external rotation, but I'm blocked with the floor here. So I'm gonna pull my hip back. After my 2 minute stretch, I'm gonna start to externally rotate the hip. Imagine my foot was on a scale. I'm trying to increase the number on the scale as I pull my hip back. I can ramp this sort of tension up to give myself a good feeling of what that internal rotation of the hip should feel like. I'm gonna ramp that up to maybe 10% of my max. As I'm ramping up, I'm gonna make sure my front leg is heavy, my upper body is collecting tension as well. My whole body, my whole system ramps up to 20%, 30%, and I can go up to as much as 100% if I wanted to. Now for this drill today, we're only gonna go to about 70%. We're gonna hold there for about 15 seconds to just really show that hip what that rotation feels like. Once we've done this pails contraction, I'm gonna flip right away, release tension, and try to almost take my weight off the scale. So imagine there's a scale on the roof, and I'm trying to get my foot to that scale. Obviously, because we're kind of blocked here, we're not gonna get that much space with the leg coming up, but we will be able to contract this tissue, which helps us pull more into more internal rotation. I'm gonna ramp that one right up to 70, hold for 10 to 20 seconds, relax all my tension, and you can see that whole time I kept my hip pulling backwards, okay? Now I would be in a new end range of hip internal rotation. So guys, now that we've done our little isometric pails and rails contractions, we've built more internal hip rotation space, it's time for us to go train that tissue. So let's grab a band, let's find something sturdy to put it around, and then let's get that band right up into our knee right here. Okay, this leg's gonna go straight, and you know, whenever I'm doing any of these exercises, I have some sort of irradiation, some sort of full body tension going on. I'm gonna keep this leg out quite laterally, and what I'm trying to feel is this internal rotation tissue do the work to pull me into the midline here. Now you see I don't have that much space, but that's okay. The pails and rails and the constant kind of attention to keep doing these drills will give me the space, and I have more space now than I've ever had in my life, but it is quite the process. As I'm doing this drill here, I'm making sure that my hip doesn't spill completely over, and I'm really trying to recruit that internal rotation tissue to pull me into the midline. I can use a bit of tension on this side as I go out too, and if I need more tension, I can just pull away from the band a little bit more. Again, tall spine, breathing, using that internal tissue to pull towards the midline, slowing down the eccentric with that internal tissue as well. So we're just trying to really feel that motion there without our hips spilling over. About 10 to 15 reps of this is good enough per side. And then we'll load the hip in a more dynamic position. All right, guys, if you've stuck with me for this long, congratulations. Some of this stuff can be a bit tedious. Let's start loading the hip internal rotation and something that probably looks more familiar to our standard strength and conditioning, okay? So I'm gonna set up into like a Bulgarian split squat, rear foot elevated split squat kind of position with my back foot very light, my back hip very light. I'm gonna try to access this hip. I'm gonna use a ball to load, and as I drop down, I'm gonna rotate into that newly acquired space. I'm gonna feel it out, I'm gonna use my foot to connect to the hip, and then as I come back up, I'm gonna kind of square up my body. So again, as I lower, I rotate, I make sure my big toe, my pinky toe, and my heel are all pushed into the floor with the tripod foot, and I push myself out of that range and come back to the center. Rotate in, push out. Whenever I'm doing a rear foot elevated split squat, I'm always looking to cut 90-degree angles for the most part and keep that rear leg very light. So the rear leg guides us, but the front leg loads. All right, guys, so listen to what Khabib says here about holding the mount. Now, if I'm holding mount and pretty much any jiu-jitsu position that I'm putting myself into, I need to hold isometric tension on my legs by internal rotation and external rotation. It's a continuous game of me using those forces to pin my opponent and to immobilize him, right? So in a jiu-jitsu setting, it's pretty obvious what internal and external rotation is doing. But let's train it in like an upright setting as well, right? So we can kind of put it into like dynamic movement, walking, running, loading, throwing balls, etc., etc. So a really simple drill I like to do here is just some split stance lateral bounding, feeling out that hip internal rotation pocket. So I'm gonna get myself into like a split stance, which kind of looks like this position. It's not like as back as a rear lunge, but I've kind of got this foot on like that B stance kickstand back there. From here, I'm gonna rotate into my hip, find that tissue, load it, make sure my foot's screwed and corkscrewed into the floor so I can really feel that tissue in this dynamic position. I'm gonna pull myself into a split stance on the other side, and as I catch, I'm gonna internally rotate. If I didn't catch with an internal rotation, it would look like that, right? So I'm starting with that internal rotation, I'm dynamically loading to the other side, back and forth. Just this split stance lateral bounding kind of helps me feel out that hip internal rotation in like an everyday movement or like an everyday space. Now I can also take that motion and pull myself forward. And now I can really start to play with the hips and even mobilize them in this dynamic setting. So try out all these drills, guys. It kind of hits all layers of hip internal rotation. And in the next video, we'll talk about hip external rotation and how to load that.